Ms. Flick, panelists, friends of Convoco. Now, after such an amazing start to our meeting today, it's difficult for me to sort of squeeze you into legislative procedures, but Ms. Flick said it quite rightly. It's about how you deal with all of the facts that you've just heard. How do these things get transferred into rule of law? Because we need to have a European rule of law so that the activities that you've described here are understood as rule of law and enforced. So I want to take you into these abstract ideas for a moment. And I want us to think about markets as well and looking at how we can find our way into rule of law. Now, when you're making sausages and when you're making laws, you shouldn't look too closely, as someone once said. But I do want to do that now. I want to look quite closely at how we could make this look. Digital industry, as we've heard, presents major challenges for industry, for manufacturing industry, service providers, and also the public administration and the government, as well as the education sector. With such sweeping disruptions, it cannot help but affect law as well in two ways. On the one hand, that law has to deal with the digital transformation as a phenomenon that requires regulating, and that life itself confronts us with the digital. And we cannot resist digitization in terms of its manifestations, the way in which it is applied in each step in the process. And this is true for all areas of the law to equal measure. And the way in which progress is implemented depends. If civil law knows comprehensive rules for structuring e-commerce, other areas of the law are still very much stuck in classical patterns of regulation. Sales of property still require notary legal documents and oral reading out of contracts that have often emerged as smart contracts through artificial intelligence. But the slower or faster transition is something we see everywhere. And one day there will also be a regulation inheritance law, such as filing a will in blockchain, and what consequences this will have for possibly excluded heirs. Thus, it is hardly surprising to anyone that competition and antitrust cannot escape this sweeping change. And in many different commissions and draft laws, we've heard about the White Book being mentioned here as well. The question of competition and how to cope with it in a digital world comes up. Now, for competition and antitrust law, this disruptive change is a particular dilemma because disruptive change describes the creative destruction, as Schumpeter described it, and is therefore a manifestation of competition in its most original form. Must then competition policy just stand and stare in admiration just because it's all so new? Perhaps the prime example of this discovery process, as Schumpeter talked about it, or this genius disappropriation process, as Walter Eucken and Franz Böhm described it, the fathers of antitrust law in Germany? Or is it necessary to adapt, tweak, intervene, and shape the rules of play for competition because competition activities are breaking through the well-known and accepted framework? Must this intervention take place long-term and with a great deal of distance, or should it take place quickly and in a more agile manner? In the following, I want to illuminate the options that a more agile competition policy offers us, but not lose sight of the extent to which agility is possible within a legal framework, without at the same time taking away the law's character of the regulating, ordering, etc. The question therefore arises as to how long-term competition policy needs to be oriented and what sort of endurance capacity it can have, and how controlling, even up to interventionist, it may be. And these are not just academic questions, they are pressing in today's world. After nearly decades of consensualism, German and European competition and antitrust law are very much at the focus of political discussions now, and the discussions are becoming so intense that show us that we're almost hearing populist terms. Thus, anyone who calls for sweeping reforms of competition policy is immediately suspected of trying to eliminate competition as an ordoliberal principle ordering things and replacing it with protectionism. Whereas on the other side of the equation, there is fear prevailing that the United States of Europe, with its system of free competition, will be ground to dust between the state systems of Asia and the interventionist trade policy of the US. So I want to explain now how competition policy can be agile, how it needs to be agile within a normative framework, and how it needs to adapt its criteria such that it can capture changing processes quickly so that all of the things that digitization is changing in our lives can be covered. To support my first theory, I will show that competition policy in recent years was indeed more dynamic than we may remember, and therefore a reforming and adaptation of the regulation framework may indeed seem like the right way forward and not seem like a sort of inappropriate, hectic adaptation of iron principles. Thus, it cannot be disputed that among the key objectives of European treaties lies the realization of European fundamental freedoms and the protection of free and undistorted competition, which you referred to as well, Dr. Flick. The objectives of completing the European single market is to be aspired to clearly in a market economy form. The treaties in Article 173 describe the way in which the European Union should work with the objective of ensuring that the Union and the member states should ensure that the necessary prerequisites for the competitiveness of industry within the Union be provided for. However, this activity of the EU serving this purpose is to take place in a system of open, competition-oriented markets. Now, we've heard about industrial policy already, so we can say that this is a clear constriction of the authorities for the legislator to derive industry policy in favor of market economy competition policy, and it is a ban on interventionist industrial policy, i.e. competition trumping. This view of the European and German antitrust law, namely a ban on agreements that restrict competition and behavior that also bans the behavior of an abuse of dominance, as well as the rules of merger control and preventing such agreements that might get in the way of effective competition, do, however, include a lot of exceptions, particularly for agriculture and the transport sector. Now, Ms. Flick already said this, the origin, i.e. the coal and steel agreement, meant, Mr. Klöckler will know this, of course, working in the steel industry, that there was a special exception for steel agreements. Thus, coal and steel were an exception. And thus we can derive that sector-specific exceptions are indeed something we are familiar with when it comes to the basic principle of market economy orientation and undistorted competition. And we've known this for years. We've had this for years. At the same time, we can say that we have seen legislation on a national and a European level through the enacting of European Council regulations and directives and case law of the courts in Luxembourg. The adaptation of European legal frameworks has taken place in long-term processes, but this is not least due to this is not due rather to the respect of the subject matter of antitrust law, but rather this slowness of European legislative procedures. That doesn't mean that the opposite is true, that one couldn't have faster, more agile adaptation of competition laws and that we should instantly give these the hated epithet of interventionism. Thus, the example of the introduction of European merger control makes it clear that there's not always been agreement about the necessity of such an instrument. At the Conference of Messina in 1956, there were already discussions about there being political aims of the community to draw up rules that would make it possible to control concentration processes to the extent that these lead to the domination of the market and thus possibly endangering a common market. It was only, however, in 1989 that the original version of the merger regulation which was 406489, which then led to the European merger regulation being introduced in the 21st of September 1990. This instrument then in 2004 was tweaked slightly, which meant that there was a substantive assessment standard of what a merger was. The history of the emergence of European merger control, therefore, shows that the existence and application of, or its existence or application is not necessarily a component of the market economy, rather a dynamic instrument to achieve an undistorted competition in the single market. The authors of the Spaak report in 1956 saw in the concentration of companies the main danger as being that through the concentration of companies, the opening of the market would endanger the market after it got rid of tariffs and contingents. The concern was triggered through the worry that without merger control, there would be an uncontrolled invasion of American and Japanese companies on the European single market, which today has been replaced, and you mentioned this, by essentially a new objective of the European Commission, namely to protect competition, to protect the European consumer. So you can see there are, in some cases, actually contradictory terms that drove this. Now, I derive the following conclusion from all of this, namely that calling for an agile competition policy essentially concurs with the previous development of legal history in European law and does not contradict adapting competition rules to global activities to pursue the aims of the European community, and in fact that adaptation continues with the way we have dealt with these things thus far. It is therefore not a break-in system to tweak our competition laws, and this means we need to ease certain standards that are being criticized in today's world. This brings me to another issue, namely the criteria by which we assess effective competition and the standards that need to be put in place here. These will be the issues that will perhaps respond to some of the questions that you asked earlier on. Here, once again, we have the problem arising of whether or not antitrust agency activities intervening in competition when the aim is free competition and the state intervention in the competition process is negatively charged as intervention, i.e. the antitrust agencies becoming active can be seen as intervention in itself. So what is a good, legitimate intervention of the state in competition, which guarantees a system of undistorted competition and does not have or create or perpetuate competition structures aimed at controlling markets? Both in the European Union and in all of the legal frameworks oriented on the market economy, the substantial assessment criteria for the legitimate intervention of the state in terms of antitrust is the prevention of the abuse of dominance of the market. and in the area of merger control. It is the prevention or strengthening of the dominance of a market. So dominance of a market is where it is legitimate to intervene. According to the definition of the European Court of Justice, there is dominance of the market if a company, through its economic position, is able to prevent effective competition on the relevant market. And the point of departure for this main issue is therefore the definition of a relevant market in which a company can dominate. So if you have critically engaged with case law and legislation with the criteria of market dominance, you'll be aware of the fact that the definition of the market is something that has been difficult. So, for example, paragraph 18 of the German Act Against Restrictions of Competition says that dominance of the market takes place where there is a factual and spatially relevant market. So a legal definition as well as the fact-based spatially relevant market definition and how this has to be assessed is left open by the law. So, for example, the guidelines on dominance of the market in merger control of the German Antitrust Office does not deal with definition of the market. An initial legislative attempt to define the market is found in paragraph 18 of the German Act Against Restrictions of Competition, which says that it does not prejudice the assumption of a market if a service is done on this market free of charge. So this was a bit of a revolution for the German legislator. Something that doesn't generate money is supposed to be a market that you can dominate. This brings us to the digital world. The legislator has therefore shown here that it is responding to the economic realities of the digital economy, and the concept of market is therefore made independent of whether or not money is generated on it or not. Now, based on which criteria in terms of factual and spatial relevance we are defining here is left open in this act, as it is in European law as well. This brings us to the decisive question of whether or not market definition is a purely empirical process, where many of the questions could be positioned that you have asked, I think, or whether or not it is a concept that has to take place on a normative basis. Now, this debate is underway, and if you follow particularly Mr. Mund from the German antitrust agency, the Federal Kartellamt, says that market definition is the best kept secret of the antitrust agencies, whereas companies are increasingly calling for the market definition to be fleshed out with normative measures as well. Thus, the debate about the Siemens-Alstom ruling and, at the moment, the failed merger between Tata and Thyssen misses the point entirely if you accuse the critics of the prohibition that they are doing this at the expense of European consumers to establish European champions and therefore are stuck in structural conservatism and against innovation. You could emotionally defuse this debate immediately if you were to simply ask the basic question of how do we define the relevant market in factual and spatial terms? And what sort of assessment do you use here? What sort of requirements need to be made if you're talking about proving the existence of a world market, if you're talking about steel, chemistry, or whatever? Or chemicals, rather. What intensity do we need to insist on evidence about when we are assessing this? This has so far been avoided by European and German legislators, and it shifts the scrutiny of correctness to the courts, who then have to develop normative standards for the empirical findings of the antitrust agencies after the fact. This is where I would like to get this discussion going, and I'm particularly happy to do it here in the ESMT because, of course, business administration professionals will be able to look at this. And essentially, the legislators have to critically engage more with the question of which normative requirements need to be made when it comes to defining the market. Now, this isn't easy because the description of a dynamic economic activity is hard to transpose into the language of the law. On the other hand, it cannot be the case that the courts directly develop standards like this in order to define the factual correctness of market definition, and on the basis of that to define what is dominance of said market. But just to come back to Siemens Alstom, on the assumption of a market, of a world market, the impact on the market would have been insignificant, and therefore they couldn't be accused of dominating the market. But by rejecting the concept of the world market and looking more at a European market, in fact, Siemens Alstom would have a very high share of the market. And so the look at this is part of the definition, because a truly legitimated competition policy cannot avoid answering the question of how you define a system of undistorted competition and how you define these relevant markets in terms of fact bases and spatial definition as well. And it's important that policymakers spell out these details and that this be integrated into applicable antitrust legislation. Now, the German legislator did this in the 9th draft of the Act I have quoted many times, the Act Against Restrictions of Competition, because paragraph 18 of it and 43 as well have a requirement for evaluation set out in the law that says that the German Ministry of the Economy and of Energy is required to report to the legislative bodies which are relevant regarding the regulations once they have come, or 3 years after they have come into force. And this can only mean that the legislator, therefore, has to be monitored, and where necessary, changes need to be made. Now, agile competitive policy works on the assumption that you can take normative assessments, and where necessary, you have to tweak things. Thus, for example, the antitrust agency needs to expand to include the legislator. The legislator has to scrutinize the function to see whether or not competition law is working. And this doesn't require this isn't a sort of a fast intervention. It is just the aim at making it work. So I think that the normative anchoring of criteria for definition is allowable as a dynamic economic development requires such definition, but at the same time you have to be able to tweak it, and you shouldn't be written off as interventionist when you do. And perhaps the result of this will therefore be new criteria above and beyond an observation based on the market in terms of antitrust law, and perhaps we will see a more open concept becoming established, such as not domination of the market, but rather domination of competition, and that this term may indeed may replace the concept of domination of the market. I see an opportunity here to capture future phenomena in terms of antitrust that may arise in the digital economy without having a direct reference to the market. Thus, for example, if you just think through the idea of competition for attention time of a person at a loose end in an autonomous vehicle being driven around, there will be competition for this person's attention. And this additional time and attention will be fought for. Now, behind all of these concepts, and this was a question that came up already, access to storage in blockchains. Behind all of these, somewhere or other, there is the activity of exchange of a market, but competition is already happening in the way running up to these, the data platforms, the data managers, the influencers, the search engines, or the gatekeepers. These define a competition in the run-up to a market. And that run-up also needs to be protected in terms of the run-up to a position that dominates the market. So I'm going to formulate this theory by saying that we need to develop beyond the concept of dominance of the market to a concept that I have described as dominance of competition as a basis for antitrust law. Briefly now, though, I'd like to look at the procedural law components of agile competition law, because often we hear people saying that the theories presented here could lead to inflationary increase of drafts of antitrust law, and that would lead to even more bureaucracy, reporting requirements, etc. And all of this would lead to interventionist competition policy, which cannot work properly. Now, again, I'd like to say that agile competition policy would make it possible for a new orientation of the antitrust authorities, and this wouldn't require new regulation agencies for the digital world. However, if you look at the workload of the European Commission or the DG competition, you will see that a lot of the activities that they do are not necessary, that bind resources which would be necessary to enforce other laws. Nearly every antitrust agency complains about lack of personnel resources. And here, all we can say is that we finally need to have new antitrust law that eases the burden on antitrust authorities. There are thousands of merger control cases that end in nothing after 90% of the cases. Now, this high level of merger control means that we have to get away from thresholds like 5 million and 25 million turnover for companies to 100 million, and then 50% of these cases will be gone. And if somebody says yes, well, then you'll have a niche market that is overlooked that may be preventing a monopoly. But if you have a market that is under 100 million, you're not going to be able to disrupt a market in a European framework. But measures like these can quickly free up antitrust agencies to focus on the development of the criteria that are necessary and transformation, and would make this a more agile system. So we need to have more agile approaches. Rethink markets is what I would say, to have a more agile competition policy. On the one hand, this would be a new valuation without turning away from the principle of free competition, a necessary normative precision of interventionist norms, and a consistent focusing and shakedown of the antitrust authorities' activities. And this would make it possible for us to achieve a free, undisrupted competition system in Europe once again.
Herr Dr. Karl, herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we learned quite a lot from that. I know that we wanted to do Q&As afterwards, but perhaps 2-3 questions for immediate clarification. Christoph Paulus, please, you have the floor. And Kai Konrad to follow.
Ist das okay?
Insofern, ich bin wiederholen.
I'm now revealing myself to an expert in insolvency law. We just heard the very important buzzword of disruption, which has a lot to do with digitization. And you said that law also needs to prepare for digitization. Now, within law, what you said about the first part about the law of competition, as there are some sophisticated legal strategies indicate, we can disrupt competition law. I don't know whether you can put it like this, but I think you know what I'm getting at. Because as part of an insolvency proceeding or restructuring procedure, competition may well be undermined to some extent because you gobble up the competitor, which you can do these days because you have all sorts of special lowdown strategies, whatever. But yes, you can then basically take over the competitor. But what about the ideal competition law concepts? Will they still be maintained? Do they still fulfill any purpose? So I'm talking around it from competition law from the insolvency point of view. Well, what you're getting at is the ideal assumption model. My question is, yes, there is the ideal assumption that in merger control you have the free and unhindered competition, but it doesn't exist like this. When we're looking at insolvency control, then partly it provided protection against the reclosing of markets, the Messina discussion as it was called, and ultimately was an interventionist act. And we said, caution here, European industry in this evolving single market is too small. If we don't protect it, the Procters, Gambles, Mitsubishis and whatever would just eat us up wholesale. And that's why we have merger control measures to protect us. You're absolutely right. Restructuring mergers is one of the items in German law on mergers and antitrust bodies, and that's what insolvency lawyers live off. After all, if you have a situation of insolvency or close to insolvency, who is most interested in any such competition situation affecting a company? It will be the competitor. And then the question we need to ask is, can I exercise control over this process, or will I need to start a debate yet again about what are the things to be weighed? There is now a comment off mic. The speaker continues into the mic. It depends on the new strategies which we have with these new ideas. As a competitor, I can control what I'm doing. I no longer depend on having my competitor go bankrupt. I simply become a creditor, and then because of governance, I can drive that company almost so close to the abyss that they voluntarily do it. Thyssen was a case in point. The whole trouble that Thyssen has been experienced the last few months is down to this strategy. I drive that company to the wall so I can take it over. That's today's type of strategy. Well, this brings us back to the traditional discussion, which I want to pick up on by means of having this agile competition policy. I don't want to wait for 20 years until somebody dares to attack merger control provisions. I have to ask instead, how can I delineate and demarcate markets? Can I do it, or do I need to impose further restrictions so that ultimately I can have a strategy aimed at can combat a strategy which aims at facilitating mergers? And that's why we need antitrust bodies to be aware of these possibilities, and then we need a legislator aware of doing something and knowing that, yes, something can be done. It's not interventionist. It's not industry policy undermining of the principle of the market economy. What it ultimately is simply a sign we react to what is happening. We're reading business news, and we are able to implement this in legislative normative elements. I see this as something which happens in many different eyes, where we said we need to act, and I say you can act. It is not interventionist. It is simply a consistent development of an agile industry or competition policy. I'm from the Institute for Tax Law and Public Finance, so I'm not in your area of expertise. Thanks for this presentation, a very clear idea how antitrust bodies, supervisory bodies in particular, can react to the solutions that we've heard postulated by the previous speaker. When I listened to Mr. Rühl, the previous speaker, I asked myself, are the changes we are seeing really so profound? In other words, is a platform substantially different from what we know from traditional business? I remember that a few decades ago, the concept of the Aldi food discounter was the topic hotly debated. Their idea was to have a huge market platform in the points that they have a marketplace, servicing lots and lots of customers. And at the same time, they developed a concept allowing him to get the many suppliers to be utterly and 100% dependent on Aldi. And that's the sort of situation which, when I compare that to Amazon, doesn't seem to me to be that different to the Amazon concept. Despite this fact, though, Aldi concepts haven't meant that we are now buying things only with this one food company, but instead there is competition. So the food sector hasn't collapsed and the companies in there, but others have emerged. So the problem we discussed did never become urgent. So I'm asking myself, as you, as competition political experts and legal experts in particular, and somebody close to the practical life, how do you see that? Where do you see the substantial difference between Amazon as a platform and the possibility of exercising market power vis-à-vis the suppliers on the one hand, and how does that compare to a food discounter with a huge market share? Well, you are almost supporting my thesis where saying we need to get away from the ordinary market dominance situation, because if I say, well, is Amazon a dominant player in the market? You could say, no, it's just one platform among many. I can cover my requirements elsewhere, but it's a relevant market. But I'm aware that there are some intermediaries who are using this market position. So the situation is not the same as Aldi. Aldi is traditional retail business. You have suppliers, you've got buyers. In the case of Amazon, we have typical scaling efforts, network effects, tipping points, and so on, which means that ultimately, in the case of Amazon, we have an omnipresent player which influences competition differently from the traditional dominant market player of the past. I see a difference, but I can't answer your question here because I can't say that with my practical experience, because it does depend on who is my client. If Amazon comes, it's fine, because the suppressed retailer excluded from the Amazon Marketplace platform because the company doesn't want to sell on Amazon, because then the company itself no longer has price control because that goes into the hands of Amazon. That's one thing. But my idea is really that when we're analyzing competition, we should divorce ourselves from this very strict idea of how we define market. And there is a development which specifically addresses issues such as what happens if I do not have access to a blockchain. The blockchain itself is basically a storage medium. So is it a market? You can spend years going through all legal stages up to the highest court, but I wouldn't want to do this. I simply call it competition. And if a competition is there, if it exists, then our antitrust bodies need to have a normative reaction, properly equipped by the legislator, and act. So, yes, I want to dismantle Google, as Ms. Dr. Fink said this. But Ms. Westphal, talking about Section 102, saying this would be an abuse of a dominant market position. And I think that view is a dangerous one. So sadly, I cannot answer your question. What I can say, though, is we need normative definitions to analyze the question properly. And then the economists should turn up and say, what are the tipping points? What are the scaling effects, which ultimately would mean Amazon is negatively viewed? Maybe very different from the way one looked at Aldi at the time. Or maybe the economists were saying, no, we can withstand all of that. And let me say this too. I used my thesis as a starting point. Competition is a disruptive act of destruction as described by Schumpeter. Normatively speaking, we could also stand and say, sorry, we don't do anything. We simply watch what's happening. It's disruptive. And then stationary book dealers and bookshops will simply go out of existence, or the corner shop will disappear because Amazon with its drones will simply push them out of existence. But that's competition. But of course, this attitude, I think, is not to be adopted. We need to have a normative reaction. It shouldn't be left to the antitrust body, the German Kartellamt, for example, or with the commissioner. Ms. Vestager is very politically activated, and she loves, fighting Thyssen, Siemens, Alstom, Google, Tata. And the question is, though de facto at the European level, that's a bit of an exception. But my question is it really possible that enforcing the rule of law is something which would depend on the character and the forceful character, that of an EG official? I'd say no. That should be something which is regulated normatively. Sorry, I couldn't answer your question properly. I simply cannot do so. This is up to the legislator to decide. Well, isn't that exciting? Because the original question was, can Europe become a global policymaker? And this normative decision, or these normative decisions, they might well emerge from within Europe, right? So if Europe were to sort of put itself together, couldn't Europe play a global role in this vein? Or can Europe regulate only for Europe? I would say that one might serve as a legislative role model and create rules that would develop such a model where we could say, yes, we can do this. We've got a legal tradition which is a mix of Anglo-Saxon case law and codified law. So we are aware of how agile law can be. So, of course, we can fight our way through different regulatory patterns and go in the WTO and adopt measures where the world would be able to say, yes, that's a system of effective competition which could serve as a role model for us. Even these dirigist systems of state-directed economies in China and other countries of Asia, they will probably also recognize one day that maybe we need more effective competition. because even the Chinese economy will have a bit of a dent in it sooner or later, one thinks, and might be that may put it in a new direction. I think we can trust ourselves to do it, but as a German comedian once says, art is beautiful, but it takes a lot of work, and it's a lot of legal work that we need to do. And that is a challenge for the European as well as the German political system. We need to analyze, recognize, detect certain matters, and it needs a really good generation of politicians who will say, right, we sit down, we write the laws, we do our best, we try and test it, and if we see it doesn't work, then we will write into the civil code, we will review what we've done after 3 years, and then we'll either improve it, change it, or abolish it. But it is not intervention, it is simply agile competition policy. Thank you. I think this is very good. We need to simply put it on our agenda, and that's definitely something for Europe to put on its agenda. Now we've defined something where Europe could showcase itself. Thorsten Ritter, SAP IT consultant, so far removed from legal affairs. But since you address this, are there possibility of global agreements? Could there be a global competition law sector, or will everybody cook his own broth, as it were? Or would we in Germany and Europe just lag behind others and will adapt our framework to meet existing others? There is an international competition network, ICN, and when we prepared for this meeting, we actually tried to invite Mr. Mund of that network, but as it happens, he is right now in Bogota at a meeting of that very international competition network. But as far as international law is concerned, that is a group of antitrust officials, not legally binding, but they're putting their heads together to discuss megatrends in enforcement matters. We do not have anything which is legally binding in international law terms. We have something in the OECD. We've seen something similar in the WTO once, but there is ultimately nothing which is binding under international law concerning international competition. But, of course, competition is also an instrument which takes power away. Look into the organizational structure of the current community of countries and see how many people have a genuine interest in a tool which would remove power from anybody. I think we only can be effective in what we're doing, and that we're doing the right things, and that we really advertise the rule of law, hoping that an agile policy would meet with an enthusiastic echo so that implementation would follow, simply because there would be acceptable, decent results generated. And because of its persuasive power, that could also be something which could be implemented internationally. But there is no such thing as an agreement, a global agreement, which would hold up under international law. I think that's a very interesting point. You said removing power. That is something which, when we prepared for this event, also became clear. We tried to invite startup entrepreneurs, many whose names we know, but we got lots of no thank you. Why is that? Because the antitrust issue, the removal of power, is something which companies don't want to identify with. But something which I did do when preparing for this meeting is to realize that the subject is incredibly exciting and very topical. And if you're opening a newspaper at the moment, never mind whether these be German, American, or British papers, it's always a focus on this type of concentration. I think it's up to all of us, and I think excellent what you've said. Thank you for that. There's a lot to be done. We're going to have a brief break, and then we'll have a discussion on the panel. Thank you.